We would like to welcome you to our 5-part training series on domestic violence, sexual assault, and disability. This series is brought to you by the Miami Inclusion Alliance. The Miami Inclusion Alliance is comprised of 4 organizations that have spent the last 3 years studying the domestic violence and sexual assault services in Miami-Dade County and how persons with disability are utilizing these services. And what we have found is that there is a disconnect between the services that our community provides and the outreach to persons with disability. This training series is the first step to bridging that gap. We're working internally to train our organizations, and then we will be going out to the community to share the knowledge and the information that we have gained. Disability Independence Group is an advocacy center for disability rights. The Lay Legal Aid is a legal entity that handles domestic violence cases. Mujer is a certified sexual assault center, and CBAC is the Miami-Dade County one-stop center for victims of domestic violence. This training series is supported by grant number 2015 FWAXK001, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. This is a 5-part training series. You will notice that we have embedded accessibility features into the trainings. All of the videos have been captioned so that you can read the words what we are speaking. All of these videos are being interpreted in American Sign Language. The font size of the words on the slides are large. We're using a sans serif font that is easy to read. And the colors used on the slides have been tested to make sure that there is a contrast between the colors for better viewing. You can watch the trainings in order for you to see what you would like. The training you are about to watch is called Domestic Violence. It will focus on the definition of domestic violence, the difference between the legal definition and the social definition, warning signs of an abusive relationship and the power and control wheel versus the equality wheel. The mission of the Miami Inclusion Alliance is to learn about the intersection of disability and domestic violence and/or sexual violence in order to promote a culture of inclusion within and between all collaborating agencies. This collaboration will implement the necessary changes so that persons with disability who are affected by domestic violence and/or sexual assault have access to services. The Coordinated Victims Assistance Center mission statement is the Coordinated Victims Assistance Center provides positive impact on our community through compassionate, comprehensive, coordinated services in a one-stop service center. CBAC, as it is called, promotes justice and provides support to people whose life have been impacted by domestic violence and abuse. Hi, my name is Yvonne Mesa, and I am going to be your speaker today. I am the Chief of the Targeted Services Bureau of Miami-Dade County for the Community Action and Human Services Department, the Coordinated Victims Assistance Center. So today we're going to talk about what is domestic violence, and we're going to talk about it from a different perspective. To start, we would like to clearly define that domestic violence is a pattern of controlling behaviors, violence or threats of violence. It could be both. That one person uses to establish power over an intimate partner in order to control that partner's actions or activities. Domestic violence is also an abusive, disrespectful, and hurtful behavior that one intimate partner chooses to use against the other partner. So it is also a learned behavior, and therefore, in many instances, it can be unlearned. Not a loss of control, but rather an exercise of power and control, used by batterers because it works, because the batterer, not the victim, the relationship, or outside factors. Relationships that fall under domestic violence could be different. Like a family or household means it could include spouses, former spouses, persons related by blood or marriage, could also include persons who are presently residing together as in a family unit or who have resided together in the past as in a family unit. Persons who are parents of a child in common, regardless of whether they have been married or not. with the exception of persons who have a child in common. The family and or household members must be currently residing, or they must have resided in the past together as in a family unit. What is not domestic violence? When we're talking about acts that are not part of the definition of domestic violence, we are referring to a disagreement, a marital spat, an anger management problem. The parties share a child in common. However, they have never resided together in the same dwelling as in a family unit. Does the relationship fall under domestic violence? Yes, it does. Read all the explain. So yes, it does, because basically they have a child in common, which is the only exception to have been residing in the same family unit. So we are now dealing with a legal definition versus a social definition. We must clarify that there are some processes for which the legal definition must be met, but there are other processes for which, if you meet the social definition, you are considered a victim of domestic violence. So to further clarify that dual definition, we're going to go into both definitions separately. So now I'd like to talk to you about the legal definition, which is included in one of the Florida statutes, Florida Statute 741.30. This statute clearly defines what domestic violence means in the state of Florida. And it means any assault, aggravated assault, battery, aggravated battery, sexual assault, stalking, kidnapping, false imprisonment, or any criminal offense resulting in physical or death of one family member or household member by another who is or was residing in the same legal dwelling or have children in common. So the social definition is completely different, and it has to do with behavior. Domestic violence is all behavior between intimate partners which harms, gains, or maintains control over another person. This definition includes emotional, verbal, sexual, or physical abuse that diminishes an individual's personal power and creates an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. If Joseph and his roommate get into a physical altercation, is it considered domestic violence? It is if they live as in a family unit. If these are two individuals who are residing in the same dwelling and have no relationship between them, then it may not be considered domestic violence because there is lack of familiarity between the parties. So now we're going to talk about warning signs of an abusive relationship. These are not all the signs, but these are some very important signs that we'd like to discuss with you today. One of them is quick attachment and expression of love. And what we are referring to this is it is not expected that if you have been in a relationship with someone for a few weeks, that you might be talking about love and commitment and marriage. It is not the natural progression of how a relationship should be. So quick attachment and expression of affection too prematurely could be a sign that you're dealing with someone who is very controlling. Frightening temper. Now we're talking about action that is taken by the other person that affects you, that makes you feel fearful, such as, for example, it could be blow up, reckless driving, it could be threats, it could be a variety of actions, but the important thing is that you are going to see this individual's behavior being frightening in nature. Also, we like to talk about rough physical treatment. Sometimes this is misinterpreted and people think that it's just that the individuals are very affectionate or very passionate. And we want to clarify that that's not the case. Rough physical treatment is definitely a warning sign that you might be dealing with an individual who is controlling and who is an abuser. Equally important, we need to talk about the fact that abusers often, or generally actually, place blame on the other person. Because what they want is they want to make it seem like they have no blame, that they're not doing anything wrong. So they end up blaming the other person. So it doesn't matter what occurred, the other person will be blamed for the actions that were brought about by the abuser. So we need to be aware of that. Breakup panic. Breakup panic is something that is very, very common in relationships that are controlling and that are abusive. I'm referring particularly to, for example, actions such as threatening with suicide, to intimidate, to coerce, to make that other person feel that if they break up, this individual is going to commit suicide, which is, at the end of the day, an act of manipulation, an act of coercion, and an act of controlling behavior. Unwanted sexual contact is also something that is very abundant in this type of relationship, because the individuals are wanting to exert power over the client, over the victim. And one way in which they feel that they are exerting that power is by forcing the other person to have unwanted sexual contact. Emotional abuse, even though is undermined by many individuals and sometimes not referred to as an act of violence under the social definition of domestic violence, we certainly validate emotional abuse, harassment, basically any act that is intended to diminish the self-esteem and self-confidence of the other party, to ridicule that individual, to make things that are important to that person look not important. All of those acts, they are all geared towards deteriorating and diminishing the emotional self-respect and self-confidence, self-esteem that the victim may possess at the time. And also, we cannot leave outside the fact that economic control and exploitation plays a big role, because there are individuals who would try purposely to control that person from a financial standpoint. They're not going to give the individual an opportunity to be independent, economically speaking. Physical restraints, such as, for example, locked doors, and things of that nature, that would send a very strong message to the victim that she doesn't have the power to, do differently. All of those behaviors are definitely signs of abusive relationships, and they should not be overlooked. Progressive social isolation. The batterer would want the victim to feel like she has no support system. So one of the things that you will see occurring very often in this type of relationship is that batterers will cut the victim off any support, including family members and friends, and basically any type of social relation and connection that that victim could have with the outside world. The batterer wants the victim to feel isolated, to feel powerless, and that is what he or she is going to try to achieve by creating that social isolation. It is very often that we see victims of domestic violence, as they are engaged in this abusive relationship, dropping their hobbies, not involving with individuals, changing their personalities. For example, people that were extroverted, people that were social, that were communicative, become introverted, antisocial, because what they're trying to do really is they're trying to hide, they're trying to prevent further acts of violence. And the way they do that is by changing and showing no interest in the outside world. They're really hiding behind that facade. Paranoid control, such as, for example, excessive questioning about the whereabouts of the victim, excessive demands in terms of knowing who the victim is speaking to, what the victim is wearing, who is she associating or he associating with, are definitely signs of someone who is paranoid in terms of control and who is going outside the norms to seek that control over the partner. Public embarrassment is also one of the many ways in which control is gained by a batterer. They would try to verbally abuse the individual in front of classmates, coworkers, family members, friends, so that they get into a situation where they already know that they better not speak in public, they better not express their opinion, because that could become indeed a very embarrassing situation for the victim. So little by little, the victim learns to be powerless. She or he may learn to just stay quiet, not say much, so that they don't create what they think it's a created domestic violence situation. So it is really never enough for some of these individuals. What I mean by that is that the behavior always will fall short of what is expected. And it's really not the victim's fault. It is a situation that the batterer would always perpetuate. So it doesn't matter. Often when I speak to victims, they tell me, well, but if I do this differently, if I cook dinner early, or if I lose weight, or if I cut my hair, or the victims would have a long list of things that if they feel that if they do differently, that might indeed reduce or eliminate the abuse when we know very well that that's not the case. The abuse that takes place in an abusive relationship is not really triggered by anything that the victim does. It's something, it's a behavior that is perpetuated by the abuser with intent to achieve control. So it doesn't matter what the victim would do, the behavior of the abuser will be the same. He would just, or she just would find different ways to go about it. So entitlement is a key factor when we're speaking of abusive relationship because basically they have a perfectly logical right way to do whatever it is that they're doing under the label of entitlement. Friends and family dislike the abuser. That is most of the time the case because when you're involved in an abusive relationship, you might have already developed sentiments and feelings of love, attraction, infatuation. All of those feelings will play a role and often will make the victim feel blinded by but not able to see the reality for what it is. However, friends and family members would be able to see some of the behaviors, some of the signs much better than what the victim who is involved in the relationship would be able to see. And that's why batters will immediately try to isolate the victim so that they don't get the feedback of that which will be considered a support system for the victim. So you are on your second date and she or he becomes upset that you speak to an old high school friend of the opposite sex and accuses you of being unfaithful. Would you consider this a warning sign of a potentially abusive relationship? And the answer is yes, most definitely, because all relationships should be based on respect and they should have a certain degree of autonomy. So if you're in a relationship and you're not able to exercise autonomy and you're not able to exercise free will, then that is a very good indication that you're in an abusive relationship. There is something that we know as the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel has 8 different components, and we see a lot of the behavior that takes place, being reflected accurately by this wheel. So we would like to discuss this wheel. I'd like to start by talking about the use of intimidation. Most batters would begin with use of intimidation, which often is not perceived at the time by the victim as an act of intimidation. It might be perceived as an act of the person is very passionate again, or very expressive, or very sensitive, or very caring, and they really want to make sure that certain things are happening in certain ways. But in actuality, we know that any activity, any behavior that is intended to create fear, to create control, such as, for example, it could be something as simple as gestures that the person would do with their hands, with their body, with their face. All of those acts are going to be intended to create that sense of intimidation. There's also the use of emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is something that is more abundant than we would like it to recognize that it is, but it is very abundant and definitely an element that is present in all, if not most, relationships that are abusive. And what we talk about here is the use of language, making the victim feel at fault, creating a situation where the victim loses her self-esteem and becomes completely powerless, so that then the abuser can go ahead and exercise his power and control, or her power and control over the victim, and create a situation of someone that deteriorates her self-esteem or his self-esteem and become paralyzed. Because when you don't have self-esteem and you are fearful of what could happen to you, your power to act becomes very much affected. And that's how they begin to gain power and control little by little. Needless to say that we are definitely talking about isolation when we talk about power and control. The batter will try to do anything in his or her power to isolate the victim. The batter does not want the victim to have a support system. So anyone and anything that would be a source of strength for the victim will be something that the abuser will target, because he wants or she wants the victim to be powerless and to not have choices. So it is very typical for batters to deny their behavior and to blame the victim. These are 2 things that occur normally simultaneously. So they will deny that what they did was abuse, while they're blaming the victim for what occurred. So we see here different type of scenarios that occurred, and again, very, very common in all abusive relationships. But the actions that have been taken by the abuser would, be described as, again, they will be minimized, if not denied. So they would have to, they would try to make it like, for example, if there was a fight and the abuser, let's say, threatened to kill the victim, the abuser would say, well, I wasn't really threatening. I was just thinking out loud, or I was just thinking and talking, but I never meant to do that. So they will get whatever it is that they did, and they would minimize it. And they would, and on top of minimizing it, they would blame it on the victim. The victim created it, you provoked me. And let's be very clear, no one provokes anyone. We are individuals that have the power of acting as we deem appropriate. So when a batterer victimizes a victim, it's not about the victims causing that behavior. It's about a well-intended behavior that is perpetuated by the aggressor, period. So using children is also a very important controlling mechanism that batterers use on an ongoing basis. And that's why children are called the silent victims, because even though they see it, they have no power to do anything about it, and they often fear for the life of their abused parent. So they would stay quiet, and they would just, very often cry and be very aware of what's going on, but they choose not to speak because they don't want to create more violence for their abused parent. Victims are normally subjected to what we call using male privilege. When we're talking about male privilege, we're talking about a series of behavior that is perpetuated by batterers, which is intended to make the batterer look as a superior type of individual. Particularly when we talk about machismo, in many cultures, men have already certain role assigned to them, and that's how they perceive a relationship through those lenses. So they will perceive certain acts to be typical and to be correct for a male to carry it out. So in those scenarios where roles are so separated in terms of what is acceptable, this is also, by the way, very cultural. There are different cultures that see roles differently, but overall, the important thing is that there is not such a thing as male privilege, and that all relationships should be based on respect and equality so that they can blossom into a healthy relationship. So using economic power, we already mentioned it briefly before, but it's definitely something that we cannot leave out of the power and control wheel, and it's very, very important because a lot of our victims are really controlled by the fact that they have no economic resources, which affects their capability to carry out their own life and to support their children and to view themselves as productive individuals. So that's why when we speak about victimization, we always encourage individuals to have something, to have a career, to study, to prepare themselves so that they do not have to financially depend upon anyone. So using coercion and threats is something very, very common in abusive relationships, and something that victims are very subjected to in this type of relationship. And we're talking about all kinds of threats. It could be a threat towards your physical body. It could be physical in nature. It could be a threat, to carry out a homicide, to kill the victim, or to kill family members of the victim. It could be against the children. But at the end of the day, we are speaking of, again, making the victim feel fearful so that she or he can be controlled and under the power of the abuser. Now, when we compare an abusive relationship to a healthy relationship, we need to mention the equality wheel, which is the opposite of the power and control wheel. It also has 8 elements, 8 components that should be compared 1 to 1, so that that's basically a choice that a victim has, that we all have in trying to maintain a healthy relationship. So instead of many of the elements or components that I mentioned before, now we're going to address the elements of a healthy relationship. And in a healthy relationship, we're talking about the abundance of non-threatening behavior. When we have a relationship that is based on equality, we are basically talking about treating each other in a respectful manner. We're talking about treating each other in a way that is comfortable. We want to make sure that the other partner can express herself and himself without fearing the consequences of what they think or do. So respect is a fundamental element of the wheel of equality, because without respect, there isn't any capacity to accept each other and respect each other's points of view. So when there is respect, there is the possibility of healthy discussions. It doesn't mean that the two have to see everything eye to eye. When there is respect, there is room for disagreement. But when there isn't respect, then there is no way in which people can express themselves freely and feel comfortable what they're doing. So trust and support are definitely core elements of a healthy relationship. Without trust and support, there cannot be a true healthy relationship. So here we're talking about the fact that, in the relationship, the partners support one another. They respect the right that each of them has to their feelings, to taking action, to conducting any activity that they choose to conduct. So it's about respecting each other and supporting each other so that they can have a loving and caring relationship. So honesty and accountability are also key elements, because again, without honesty and accountability, then we couldn't talk about trust, or we couldn't talk about respect. So many of these elements are intricate parts of one another. So honesty and accountability has to deals with the responsibility that each person brings into the relationship. The acknowledgement, if an act has occurred, if something has occurred, acknowledging what occurred, looking at it very honestly and trying to hold yourself accountable for whatever it is that you did wrong, communicating openly and truthfully about what occurred and finding a solution within that context. Responsible parenting. We talked about in the power and control wheel, we talked about using the children as a mechanism to further control the victim. Now we're talking about being both responsible for parenting, for the quality of parenting that is going to take place in this household or in this relationship. We're talking about not putting each other down and not giving each other any additional power in front of the children, not using the children to achieve anything that we may want out of our partner, but respecting the children, respecting and creating a nonviolent atmosphere where they can grow and blossom, because we know that domestic violence affects children very much. And we know that without having a responsible parenting model, children cannot grow to be healthy individuals. Shared responsibility. When we look at an equality wheel, when we look at a healthy relationship, one of the most important elements would be having that sense of the shared responsibility, which means mutually agreeing on what they do as a unit, and not having a situation where we talked about before, where there is supremacy, where there's male privileges. We're talking about sharing the responsibilities, sharing their life together, and creating a situation that is fair for both, and where family decisions are made together, giving each other the same value for their opinions. Economic partnerships. Here we're talking about just the opposite of what we discussed before, which was to use the economy of an individual to further control. Here we're talking about having a relationship where both partners have access to financial resources in an equal fashion, where nobody is dependent upon the other one to make the most elemental, fundamental decisions that individuals should be able to do in a relationship to be healthy individuals. So negotiation and fairness, again, right in the same category as economic partnerships and many of the components that we talked about before. We need to be able to negotiate with fairness. When there is not an equilibrium of power in a relationship, there isn't any possibility to really negotiate. That's why, for example, mediation is not a recommended method of communication or addressing any party where domestic violence exists, because there is lack of equality when it comes to power. So here we're talking about accepting the things that need to be changed, being able to compromise and being able to resolve conflict. So how do victims cope with all of these things that we have mentioned before? They often cope by, things that are really at the end, mechanisms of they have created these mechanisms to be able to support or sustain what is going on in their lives. Such as, for example, victims do learn helpless behavior. They learn to minimize everything that is happening because it's easier for them to minimize it than to acknowledge that they're really in an abusive relationship and to have to take that step of actually bringing the relationship to accountability. So it's easier sometimes to just minimize what is going on to feel more comfortable and to be able to live with it more comfortably. Deny. We talked about denial of what is going on is something that it's a coping mechanism. Victims do it all the time to, again, be able to deal with what is happening to them. Often victims think that they are going to be able to walk away from the relationship, that the battle is going to change, that if they get married or if they get engaged or if they if they lose weight, if they let their hair grow, there are endless of reasons why victims sometimes think that if they do something differently, the abuse is going to be reduced or eliminated, when we know that that's not the case. Self-medicate, that's a real problem for victims of domestic violence, because in an effort to try to endure what's happening to them and feeling that they don't have the resources to really make a difference at the time, they choose to stay. And they choose to self-medicate themselves often to be able to endure the feelings and basically the impact that an abusive relationship will have on a victim. They stay in relationships that are very dangerous. They stay because they fear what would happen if they leave. Because let's make it very clear. It has been estimated that the most difficult time and the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is not when she or he is in the actual abusive relationship, but it is when she or he make the decision of leaving the abuser. Because remember, this is all about power and control. So when a victim chooses to leave, the power and control is now reduced, and the batterer now begins to see that he or she is losing control over the victim, and that makes them more dangerous. They normally take responsibility. They don't take responsibility. What they do is they blame others. They might blame family members. They might blame other external factors, but they basically would not take responsibility for what is happening because, again, they are emotionally, physically, often in a situation where they're not feeling their best. Victims often, if not always, believe that the batterer will change. They believe that if they obey and they behave in different ways, that is going to have a direct impact on reducing the possibilities of abuse, when we know that that's not the case. But that is what they believe, and that is what the batterers will want the victim to believe. So that is what they're going to promote. Victims sometimes choose to seek help and protection, but nationally, it has been estimated that it takes a victim the average of 7 episodes of violence to finally get themselves to seek out help. So when we're helping a victim of domestic violence, we need to keep that in mind. We don't know if our intervention might be the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th. So we have to understand that if what we do does not bring about the separation immediately, that doesn't mean that we have failed to make a difference in this victim's life. It means simply that right now the victim may not be able to carry on this escape, but that doesn't mean that we have not affected their life positively. Your newlywed husband doesn't allow you to see your family, friends, or doctor alone. Is this a form of physical abuse, economic abuse, isolation, or all of the above? It is basically all of the above, because when we talk about not being able to see someone, not being able to see a family and be able to conduct yourself normally, there is a little bit there of everything that could potentially, there is definitely an element of isolation, but there is also the possible consequence that if this could become a physical abuse scenario in the future, because if you do choose to see a friend, if you do choose to see a family member, what could happen to the victim? It could actually escalate to a physical abuse. And depending upon the situation of the victim, there could be economic abuse as well, as is often part of all abusive relationships. So Is there, we've talked about all of these different type of situations, scenarios, and important components. So there are several resources available to victims and survivors. For domestic violence, there is a national domestic violence hotline, and the phone number is 1-800-799-7233. At the state level, you can call the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which stands for the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. The phone number is 1-800-500-119. At the local level, you can call CVAC, which is the Coordinated Victims Assistance Center, where you can find different type of help. And that's also called Miami-Dade County Family Justice Center. The phone number is 305-285-5900. For sexual violence at the national level, you can call RAINY, which stands for the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. The phone number is 1-800-656-4673. At the state level, you can call the Florida Coalition for Sexual Abuse, Florida Coalition, which stands for the Florida Coalition Against Sexual Abuse. The phone number is 1-888-956-7273. At the local level, you can call MUJER, one of our local sexual assault centers. The phone number is 305-763-2459. Thank you for watching the training Domestic Violence. Please make sure that you watch the other 4 training in our 5-part series. If you have any questions, please contact CVAC at 305-285-5900. Thank you.